The oars bite through a moonlit bay on December 5, 1492, and firelight from Taíno villages flickers like fallen constellations along the north coast of an island not yet named by Europe. Within weeks, the name that sticks is Hispaniola, half promise and half blank page for an experiment welded from gold hunger, missionary zeal, and royal paperwork. Behind wet planks and salt-stiff sails arrives more than timber and iron. It is an idea refined in centuries of Iberian frontier. Some men claim a right to command others in the name of crown and God. That idea will harden into a device with a gentle name and a brutal function, Encomienda, tested here among fields of yucca and rivers bright as coins. Who lived here before the word Encomienda crossed the surf? Taíno cacicazgos knot the island into a web of kinship, ritual, and redistribution, led by figures like Guacanagari, Caunabo, Behechio, and Anacayona. In plazas shaped for areitos, drums call steps that carry history as memory rather than ink, and the Canuco mounds promise cassava bread even in thin months. Fishing grounds feed villages, war remains ritual and measured, and the seasons mark labor more than orders do. The first Europeans see abundance and read it as inventory, offering trinkets while eyeing arroyos that sparkle with flakes of gold. What begins as gift exchange tilts into tribute, and a moral economy cracks under a weight it never agreed to carry. It matters now because the fall of a society often begins with a small twist to how people trade and honor each other. When reciprocity becomes tax and hospitality becomes liability, conflict stops being ritual and turns relentless. How does conquest jump from gesture to system, from system to daily routine? In 1494, La Isabela rises in mud and ash, a hard-edged village of lime kilns, rough chapels, and ledger tables dragged to the tropics. Gold of lavaderos, scooped in half gourds, turns into countable quotas measured in arbitrary containers like a hawk's bell filled with river dust. Early repartimientos assign people to men they do not choose, a prelude to Encomienda that claims to protect and teach while extracting labor without negotiation. Alonso de Ojeda scouts and punishes, Pedro Margarite roams and quarrels, and the crown sends orders that lean toward mercy but calculate returns. La Isabela fails to feed itself, yet the failure does not cancel the idea. It clarifies that violence must be organized within law to be permanent. This matters now because empires invade not only with steel, but with stamps, seals, and vocabularies that make coercion look like administration. Once ink blesses extraction, the calendar fills with obligations, and the whip hides behind a rubric. What exactly is an encomienda, and why does it sound pious when it isn't? In the Iberian past, to commend means to entrust souls and lands to a lord who ought to defend and guide, a feudal echo dressed in theology. On Hispaniola between 1495 and 1503, encomienda becomes a royal concession that assigns Taíno tributaries to a Spaniard, obliged to teach doctrine and care, while expecting months of labor in mines, estancias, and obrajes. The papers say no one owns people, but the power to order bodies through space and time behaves like ownership all the same. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla replaces Columbus and reshuffles assignments. In 1502, Nicolás de Ovando arrives with the largest fleet the island has seen and a will to regularize. He builds roads and estancias, demands quotas, relocates communities, and breaks cacicazgos into administrable units that fit a ledger. It matters now because the island reveals the paradox that will cross a continent, a doctrine of charity yoked to an economy of exhaustion. The name is devout, the result is arithmetic, and between both thousands of lives are spent like small coins. How do the cacicazgos respond when extraction tightens like a fist? Caunabo, lord of Maguana, answers the ruin of Navidad with force and is captured by trickery, a sign that war has left ritual and entered deception. Guarionex rebels in his fertile valley under the pressure of gold tribute. while in 1503 the pacification of Higüey shows a policy of terror dressed as order, Xaragua will hear the promise of parley and receive the trap. Anacaona's grace meets a gallows, and the plaza becomes a warning poster for a new regime. Villages burn, bohíos empty, and families are marched away from the canucos that held their memory together. Violence does more than take lives. It breaks cycles, and when cycles break, agricultural time loses its compass. It matters now because the anatomy of collapse is not reducible to germs falling from the sky. Disease kills, but hunger schedules and forced marches decide who reaches winter alive. When do diseases arrive, and how do they multiply catastrophe? Fever travels with the first ships and takes a toll in the 1490s, but the Great Wave rolls in 1518 when smallpox enters and moves like invisible fire through valleys and coasts. Measles, typhus, and influenza ride behind it, and onto those pathogens, the colony straps shifts in mines and estancias, thin rations and punishments that cancel rest. A society cannot heal when caregivers are dead, fields untended, and the day's energy belongs to quotas. By 1510 counts dive. By 1514 registers show tens of thousands where there were hundreds of thousands. And the 1520s keep subtracting voices from the island's chorus. No single number can hold the loss, but a generation is enough to push a people to the cliff's edge. It matters now because we must read three curves together: microbes, forced labor, and social disintegration. To say epidemic without asking who had the right to stop working is to erase policy from biology. Was there conscience inside the machine, or only blindness with a crown? In 1511, a Dominican friar, Antonio de Montesinos, thunders from a coral stone pulpit. These are people. Do they not have souls? Are you not in mortal sin? The echo crosses streets to a colonist who changes course, Bartolomé de las Casas, who after 1514 devotes his life to petitions, chronicles, and an insistence that law must restrain greed. In 1512 to 1513, the Laws of Burgos tried to regulate food, rest, instruction, and Sundays, disciplining cruelty while legalizing structure. In 1542, the new laws strike at inheritance and perpetual servitude, provoking rebellions and the notorious formula, obey but do not comply. Courts argue, governors stall, and planters learn the art of delay, while the crown learns the cost of insistence. It matters now because sermons and statutes shift the story but can fail if incentives stay welded to extraction. Conscience speaks, law writes, yet practice flows toward profit unless profit is redefined. What happens when Taíno labor can no longer hold the building up? From 1,501 licenses trickle in to import enslaved Africans. And as the indigenous population collapses, shipments grow through the 1510s and 1520s. Cattle thrive on open range. The first sugar ingenios demand steady hands and hot nights at cauldrons. And Santo Domingo, founded in 1496, becomes a hinge on an Atlantic that now functions like a machine. The Real Audiencia of Santo Domingo, established in 1511, arbitrates disputes, while the Casa de la Contratación in Seville, founded in 1503, certifies maps, pilots, and cargo. Encomienda does not vanish. It adapts, coexisting with African slavery and repartimiento. Rotating drafts paid token wages under compulsion. The island exports procedures the way it exports hides and sugar to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Tierra Firme, and New Spain, where local conditions change the costume but not the script. It matters now because the template for plantation economies and pigment-ranked societies takes shape here in a decade and a half. Later centuries inherit habits born in a rush of decisions, taken far from canucos and too close to account books. What does life feel like inside an encomienda when the calendar of faith collides with the calendar of gold? At first light, one crew heads to the river with bateas, another to the shaft where beams groan, and others to the pasture to rope cattle half-wild from new abundance. Catechism waits for the afternoon, a handful of prayers traded for the day's breath while a bell counts not only mass, but bodies. A principal who once was cacique bargains for kin, discovering that leadership without the power to feed is a title without teeth. In the bohio, a mother cools a fever with herbs she trusts, but the tally allows no absences, and the lash is a clock with no mercy. Sunday promises rest, yet distance and chores shorten it to a sigh. It matters now because power often hides in details, a hand with a list, a mark beside a name, a ration weighted by favor or fear. History is not only decrees, it is bare feet on wet stone and wrists that ache toward dusk. Did resistance outlive the massacres, or did silence swallow everything? Between 1519 and 1533, Enriquillo, Christian-schooled and bound by kin to cacique lines, leads a rebellion from the Bajoruco Mountains, cutting supply roads, freeing captives, and turning terrain into ally. He knows Spanish law and exploits its promises, a tactic that confounds a crown eager to economize on violence. By 1533, a truce recognizes settlements for his people, a narrow door opened within a fortress otherwise sealed. Resistance does not dissolve the structure, yet it rescues lives, memories, and dignity. And it plants seeds for future Maroons and Palanques across mainland and islands. Hispaniola is not only a workshop of extraction, it is a school of escape and negotiation. It matters now because subaltern agency persists even where archives are thin. Victories may be small, but they keep the edifice from perfection. Why does a chapter so early still bend shadows over present debates? Because first institutions build paths, and paths become habits that survive the men who made them. By yoking salvation to tribute, Encomienda normalized a pedagogy of inequality that later migrated into haciendas and plantations with new legal faces and old expectations. The demographic cliff became someone's argument to import more enslaved labor, producing color-coded hierarchies that still leak into surnames, neighborhoods, and paychecks. When we argue today about extractivism, land rights, consultation, and development, we replay a script drafted in coral stone offices and copied into valleys where nobody was asked. To design models for the Caribbean and Latin America that do not repeat the first mistake, we have to reject growth that counts goods while discounting people. It matters now because every plan that ignores the communities closest to the land reopens the first wound. Reparation, symbolic and material, is not luxury. It is the price of a shared story that does not wobble. How do we tell the end of a society when its language thins and its temples go quiet, yet its blood moves in the living? The Taíno world does not vanish into myth. It threads into words we still say, foods we still cook, and faces we still recognize even if censuses refuse their categories. A cathedral rises in Santo Domingo, the audiencia files, fleets depart, and the island divides into two nations with a common root in that early laboratory. Archives hold royal orders, complaints, and pleas, and through their cracks we hear the same request repeated for centuries, that work not be a slow sentence and law not a mask. The lesson bites, but it is clear, no system that reduces persons to extractive units can yield a stable and just community. Hispaniola proved it in public, and the 16th century multiplied the proof across seas. It matters now, because the island gives us a measuring stick to hold against our own institutions. Who gains when we say progress, and who pays when we turn progress into method? What remains when the experiment ends on paper but continues in practice across a hemisphere? The responsibility of naming remains, because the word encomienda sounded guardian-like while it hid compulsion as policy. We must see that collapses rarely have a single cause. They braid disease, dispossession, forced labor, displacement, and exemplary terror into one rope. We must also admit that critics rose early, that laws tried to break the machine, and that the tug-of-war between greed and rule became part of the region's political DNA. Most of all, we should refuse to use memory only as accusation and begin to treat it as design guidance. so the next grand project does not copy the first. Every time efficiency is split from ethics, Hispaniola returns like a warning bell carried on trade winds. It matters now in arguments about tourism, mining, agro-industry, and energy, because the ghost of Encomienda asks if our metrics have learned to count lives. If the answer still hesitates, Maguana and Xaragua remind us that peace is not decreed. It is bargained, and a bargain without justice is hush imposed. Can an island that taught a continent how to command also teach us how to refuse? Maybe, if we accept that in the same geography that rehearsed subordination, people invented negotiation, maroonage, cofradias, satire, devotion, and critique. Hispaniola and the Encomienda show that no project of domination is total, that the law can be hammer or shelter depending on the hand that wields it, and that institutions matter because they quietly choreograph daily breath. If we want societies where labor is not an illness and faith is no alibi for punishment, the first step is to name things honestly and design incentives that reward care. In the murmur of palms and the toll of coral stone bells, the island keeps a lesson scored into its shoreline, a laboratory that opened highways to official wealth and carved voids where hundreds of villages once sang. Will we measure our success by the life we sustain rather than the metal we weigh? And if not, what name will the next island give to its sorrow?